From early pioneers to modern trailblazers, this is the story of how Black women writers carved their space in the romance novel industry. Romance books are now part of a billion-dollar mass-market industry which can be traced back to romantic fiction of the 18th and 19th centuries. As the romance genre expanded over time, one thing stayed the same. The books all centered around the lives of white women. Publishing houses weren't interested in stories that centered Black people's lives, and certainly not our love lives. The idea of us being loved or being in love was not on the agenda, and publishing houses presumed readers wouldn't be interested in our love lives either. And so they rejected Black-centered romance books for decades. I'm Alicia, and this is episode 3 of the Published Sisters podcast. Today, I'm sharing a brief history of Black women writers in the romance novel industry. And toward the end of this episode, I'll be sharing 3 key takeaways that we can get from this history specifically for writers if you want to write a book. So stick to the end if you want to get the takeaways. And I'll be focusing on the United States romance industry. I have plans to do deep dives on other countries' industries coming up, so subscribe and stay tuned. In this episode, I wish I had time to discuss every Black woman romance author and book, but instead I chose a selection. No disrespect to any authors who aren't mentioned. There are many. Okay, let's get to it. One of the first novels by a Black American woman was by poet, abolitionist, activist Frances E. W. Harper, who wrote Iola Leroy, published in 1892. While it wasn't a traditional romance novel, it was set around the Civil War time and explored the main character's struggles as a mixed-race woman, both as a slave and as a free person. Even though it wasn't focused solely on romance, the book portrayed the protagonist's love story, and so it's worthy of mention and acknowledgement. But after that book in 1892, not much was happening in terms of Black romance novel publishing, all the way through the mid-20th century. So let's fast forward to 1969, when Ruby Sanders published 4 books between 69 and 71, chronicling the life and loves of Nurse Marilyn Morgan RN. These books featured a nurse-doctor romance storyline. During the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a booming trend of medical romances, but of course, what made Sanders' books different was that her books featured a Black woman as the main character. All 4 were published as part of Signet's nurse romance line. There's very little known about Ruby Sanders, but what we do know is that those 4 publications were groundbreaking. Now we enter the 70s. For each of the upcoming time periods, before I mention the romance books, I'll also first set the context. I'll share a few cultural highlights of what was happening mainstream across the Black community in the United States. So, the 1970s. The Black arts movement, which had started in the 60s, remained notable in the 70s, spearheaded by the poet Amiri Baraka and also Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez, to name a few, who used their work to celebrate Black identity and critique systemic racism and institutional inequalities. On the music scene, R&B, funk, soul, disco emerged as dominant cultural forces. Fashion embraced Afrocentric styles with afros, dashikis, and African-inspired jewelry symbolizing pride in Black heritage. The 1970s also saw the rise of Blaxploitation films. On television, shows like Good Times and The Jeffersons brought Black families into the mainstream, offering comedic and serious explorations of Black life. In terms of romance novels, in 1974, Anne Allen Shockley published Loving Her, featuring a Black lesbian protagonist. It was the first of its kind and was a landmark novel. Okay, now we jump to the 80s, where we had a definite increase in Black romance novels. In terms of arts and culture, this time saw the rise of hip-hop culture and movies like Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing and mainstream Black family shows like The Cosby Show, featuring a counter-narrative to pervasive stereotypes. Romance novel-wise, many more Black women authors broke ground. Authors like Elsie Washington writing as Rosalind Wells with Entwined Destinies in 1980, and Leah Sanders, which was also a pseudonym, publishing The Tender Mending in 1982, And also, in the mid-80s, Sandra Kitt's Adam and Eva, which became Harlequin's first romance featuring black main characters. All of these novels showing that black love stories were valid, marketable, and they centered black characters in unapologetically romantic narratives. Then, in 1989, Terry McMillan published Disappearing Acts. The novel explored the realities of love, class, and ambition, reflecting the economic struggles of shifting gender roles of the 80s. Now we reach the 90s. Oh, what a great time. I'm probably dating myself. Setting the scene, on television, we had shows like Martin, Living Single, In Living Color, and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which celebrated black culture and everyday life, offering humor and relatability. Oprah Winfrey became an international phenomenon. Films like John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, The Hughes Brothers' Menace to Society were popular. We also had romantic comedy hits like Love Jones and The Best Man. In terms of romance novels, the overall lack of diversity in the industry caught the attention of Letitia Peoples, an avid romance reader who felt disillusioned by the lusty stories of white characters and the oppression of black ones. It's said that Peoples retired from her job, took publishing classes, took $10,000 from her retirement, and in 1990 started Odyssey Books publishing press focused on black romance. In 1995, prolific writer Brenda Jackson published Tonight and Forever under Pinnacle Books' Arabesque line. Arabesque was a black romance line launched in 1994. Throughout the 90s, many other black romance writers would publish under that line. Brenda Jackson is one of the prolific writers mentioned in this episode. To date, she's written over 100 novels and novellas. Meanwhile, Beverly Jenkins, known as the Queen of Black Historical Romance, was also busy writing and publishing in the 90s. Her debut novel, Night Song, was published in 1994, and it was a game changer. Jenkins not only wrote love stories, but rooted them in Black history, giving readers a rich tapestry of culture, resilience, and passion. Jenkins has now written over 40 books. Another prolific writer, which I've already mentioned, is the acclaimed Terry McMillan, who published 2 romantic comedies in this decade, Waiting to Exhale and How Stella Got Her Groove Back, both of which were adapted into hit Hollywood movies. Now let's talk about the 2000s to the present day. Black romance authors continue to expand the genre, but it's still a battle. The lead characters of most romance novels typically fit into a narrow aesthetic, cultural, and ethnic description. So black authors continue to fight for visibility in the romance industry. Nevertheless, thanks to platforms like Book Talk and BookTube, TikTok and YouTube, and also thanks to black writers persevering with publishing houses and others taking advantage of self-publishing, between all of these things and more, we have seen a resurgence of black romance books. Many of the authors I already mentioned, such as Brenda Jackson, Beverly Jenkins, Rochelle Ehlers, Terry McMillan, continue to write and add to the selection of books. And of course, there are many other writers who've joined in, such as Farah Roshan, Talia Hibbert, Kennedy Ryan, Jasmine Guillory, and so many more, way more than I could ever name, crafting stories that blend romance with real-life issues. They're showing that black women's love stories are as diverse and powerful as we are. As promised, I'm sharing a few key takeaways for aspiring writers. Takeaway number 1, there is an obvious market and a need for your books. The fact that the market is still underserved emphasizes even more that there is a need for you to write your books. Takeaway number 2, if you aren't being invited to the table, build your own. I gave several examples here of writers who did that. Takeaway number 3, no one else will write our stories. They won't and they cannot. If you've been dreaming about writing a romance book or any other book in another genre, let this be your sign to start. Click the first link in the description below the video to join the writing community. I hope this video inspired you to check out romance authors mentioned, and of course, if there are any that you love, any of your favorite writers, and that I didn't mention them, drop the name in the comments below. I challenge you to pick up a book by one of the authors I mentioned today, or any of them if anybody mentions in the comments. I curate a massive list of books by Black women, and you can find the authors I mentioned today on that list. The link for you to view the list is in the description below. Thanks for tuning in to episode 3 of the Published Sisters podcast.